Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the Hill Country. And before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and the exact minute your clock reads when these words find you, because time is a map in this story, and we are tracking where the lines cross. The year was 1903, deep winter fading into a soaked and stubborn March, and a one-room meeting hall at the edge of a river bend stood unlocked at dawn, with lamps cold, benches squared, and a chalkboard that read in a careful hand, "Do not answer the fourth strike." The stove held ash, the color of old coins. A tin dipper lay dry, beside a bucket that should have sweated with night chill, and a length of black cloth, neatly hemmed, had been draped over a hanging mirror, as if a mourning ritual had begun without a death to justify it. There were no footprints in the red clay around the threshold, besides those cut by yesterday's boots. No sign of pry bar or crow, only a stillness that behaved like a person who knew you were watching. A county constable wrote in his book that the place felt held, though he crossed that word out and wrote quiet instead. And across the page, pressed into the paper by a hard hand, the ghost of the first word remains. The official account kept to straight lines, noting the absence of 3 regulars who tended the bell and stove and the ledger. But the private papers of a circuit rider recorded something different. A bell sounding by itself at precisely 9, 10, 9:11, and 9:12 the night before. Not the full-voiced clang of a rope pull, lead mouth, but 3 thin heartbeats of metal. Then a span of silence so dense the notes seemed to float inside it like seeds under glass. The settlement, small and stubborn and more inward than shy, had noticed other peculiarities. As winter thinned, the general store's ledger showed unusual orders for crepe and mirror backing. Someone had sent for 7 pounds of rock salt in a week when the roads were riven with mud, and the rail manifest recorded 3 crates with a circle within circle mark no one could trace to a wholesaler. A pharmacist who kept a camera to indulge his curiosity made a plate of the river bend after a flood and found, when he peered at it under his magnifying glass, a faint ripple of brightness in the gravel, like heat without warmth, a gleam that seemed to want to be a shape. He tucked that negative into an envelope and wrote, "Keep for later" on the flap, then crossed out later and wrote, "Never." The first real piece of evidence that refused to sit down came from a pocket diary kept by a bookish woman who watched the sky for weather and solace. A line scrawled across the page for the 8th of the month. The bank clock lags if you stand beneath it and whisper. She drew a small diagram of the courthouse square, with an arrow aimed at the south face of the tower, and beneath that wrote, "Do not speak near the bronze after sunset." There were other lines that should not be dismissed. An odd notice pinned to a fence post, offering cash for any old mirrors, regardless of condition. A scrap of staff paper found under a bench in the meeting hall, with 3 notes marked D and the rest of the bar left blank, and a folded letter without address left under the door at the parsonage that read, "If you hear 3, you must not be the 4th." The hall's cupboard held a brass cylinder with a glass face and a fixed crank, a device no one claimed and everyone handled as if it might shout, its pointer resting at 0 as though asleep, and a taste of iron rising in the mouth when you leaned close. The constable did a practical thing and took the cylinder home in a sack, and the clock on his mantel began to hesitate at the half-minute, widening its tick and closing its talk until the sound felt like a breathing animal trying not to disturb a nest. The dog that slept under the table lifted its head once, looked at nothing, and lowered it again with the carefulness you give a breakable thing. Word moved through the settlement as slowly and exactly as the river does in winter, and at dusk they met in the hall, because that is what you do when the floor under your life shifts. You go stand somewhere with a door and a shared roof, even if the door has decided it belongs to the air. People who had no time for ceremony brought vinegar and iron nails. Because tradition is an instrument even when you can't hear its key. And the women covered the tin kettle's shine with a towel, as if reflection itself could tempt a wrong answer. A ledger man, whose fingers knew numbers like a fiddler, knows the strings, sat by the chalkboard with his pencil tucked behind his ear. And the circuit rider folded his hands and kept his eyes on the window, not because anything was there. Boo! Don't, because sometimes windows tell you how the unseen moves. What came next is written in 3 places by 3 different hands, and though the words differ, their shape is the same. At 9:10, a small sound in the bell metal like a fingertip. At 9:11 a second. At 9:12 a third, each spaced with a patience that made the hairs along the wrist rise. And after that, nothing answered them. No one in that room supplied a 4th strike. It is striking how their accounts do not lean toward fear at that moment, but toward restraint, toward the shared understanding that sometimes the only safe response to an address is to remain unaddressed. The air in the hall changed in a way you can only describe by metaphor, cellar cool, and breathed on. And the black cloth over the mirror rippled, as if a draft had come from inside the glass, not from the room, and then smoothed itself, as if the thing that had pressed against it had been satisfied by its own reflection. In the morning, someone wrote on the chalkboard beneath the sentence that had been there before, a small addition in the same careful hand, though the others swore no one had chalked it. Count backward if you must count at all. You should know by now how the record keeps its teeth hidden. Official pages kept their neutral corners, but a separate scrap in the constable's ledger, a page he folded and slid behind the binding, reads, "The quiet moved like a person toward the door after the 3rd. And when it reached the threshold, the lamp flames grew taller by the width of a thumbnail. The pharmacist's second plate, made in poor light because he could not help himself, shows a shadow at the bell mouth that is not rope and not bird and not weather, a bruise of form that persuades by the very weakness of its outline. And a letter reached the rail office, without a stamp, carried by no one the clerk can name, with a line in a tidy hand. The box with circles arrives tomorrow. Do not ring the freight bell at any hour. Unload by gesture." The clerk pinned it to the wall and forgot it, and when he looked again, the paper had darkened as if left near heat. Across the week that followed, small things grew reluctant to answer loud things. A sledge missed its confident note when it met the head of a spike, a spoon tapped against a cup and sounded like a moth, boots met plank, and the plank did not reply. If you are listening carefully, you will notice the story is telling itself through subtractions, the way a river marks its bed by what it refuses to carry. That is deliberate, because in this county, in that year, the center of the case was not an act committed, but a reply withheld. And still, beneath all the caution, something else was organizing, something as old as water slipping through limestone, a pattern that seemed to prefer 3s, a patience that leaned toward the minute when clocks nudge against themselves, and a habit of choosing the room where people sit in a circle, with their eyes open but their voices quiet, as if the thing they hope will not come is listening for them to prove they are worth being ignored. The fragments that remained after that night drifted like pollen, fine, weightless, and impossible to contain. A month later, the county seat received an envelope without a return address containing a single scrap of ledger paper. The handwriting was exact, the kind taught in business colleges that prized uniformity over warmth. It read only, 3 heard, 1 withheld. The balance maintained. The sheriff filed it among prank correspondence, but noted privately that the postmark came from their own town. By then, the meeting hall had been shuttered. The black crepe over the mirror still hung in place, dusty but unmoved, and those who ventured close swore that the reflection beneath it grew lighter each evening, as though something luminous were gathering just behind the cloth. The constable, who had carried the brass cylinder home, tried returning it to the hall on the 17th of April. When he opened the sack, he found the glass face fractured but unbroken, held together by invisible tension. The needle had moved, climbing halfway up the dial, despite the lack of winding. That night, he dreamed of tapping sounds. 3 measured knocks, each separated by an intake of breath, then silence. He awoke to find his mantel clock at a standstill, both hands fixed at 9:12. His report ends there. Spring crept in unevenly. The river rose, then sank back into its clay banks, leaving behind streaks of salt and driftwood pale as bone. On certain nights the water seemed to hum, low and even, a vibration that settled in the jaw. Children said it made their teeth hurt. The old men at the store dismissed it as a frog song carried through the current, until one of them carried a bucket home and swore that the vibration continued, long after the water had gone still. No one went to draw from that bend after dark. The woman who had written about the bank clock's hesitation continued her observations. Her final entry, dated April 20th, records a peculiar event. Standing near the courthouse, I saw my shadow divide. For a heartbeat there were 2 of me, then one again. The air at that moment seemed to lean. The entry below it was left blank, except for the trace of graphite pressed so hard it tore the paper. By early May, trains passing through the county reported telegraph interference near milepost 76. Operators described rhythmic interruptions in the line. A series of 3 clicks, pause, 3 clicks, pause. One conductor noted that the sequence synchronized with the crossing bell at the east end of the yard, though no signalman was operating it. The railway investigation produced nothing conclusive, only the statement that sound carries unpredictably through moist limestone. A traveling inspector for the Postal Service arrived in town on May 12th to examine complaints of missing correspondence. His logbook, preserved in federal archives, mentions a conversation with the pharmacist, the same man who had taken the peculiar photographs. The inspector's description of him is terse but telling, eyes fixed on something behind you, even when he's looking straight ahead. The pharmacist handed over one of his glass plates, saying only, "You might as well keep it. It keeps returning." The inspector recorded this without comment. When the plate was later developed in the federal office at Louisville, it revealed what appears to be the interior of the meeting hall taken at night. The exposure shows the empty room lit by the faint glow of a lamp on the desk. Behind the draped mirror stands a human silhouette, blurred but upright, facing the camera. Experts argued it was the photographer's shadow. The difficulty is that the figure's proportions do not match his. It is taller, the shoulders are narrow, and the neck is impossibly long. Around this time, strange sicknesses began circulating through the settlement. Nothing violent, only fatigue, an aversion to noise, and in several cases, a sensitivity to bright light. The doctor called it nervous exhaustion and prescribed quiet. It spread unevenly, ignoring households the way storms skip ridges. At the general store, customers began whispering instead of speaking, as if speech itself might echo the wrong way. Then came the incident of the river lanterns. On the evening of June 9th, 3 fishermen returning from downstream saw lights moving beneath the water, pale and regular, spaced like the rhythm of footsteps. They followed the glow along the bank for nearly half a mile before it sank and vanished. The next morning, the bell in the hall rang audibly as far as the ridgeline, though the rope had long since been removed. The sound was described as hollow but deliberate, like breath caught in metal. The sheriff, pressed by letters from neighboring towns, reopened the file. He visited the hall and recorded in his notes that the mirror cloth had fallen. The glass beneath was clear and cold, yet his reflection did not match his movement. It blinked after he did. He left without replacing the cloth. By mid-July, the settlement had thinned. Families left quietly, citing the harvest or relatives elsewhere. The official census of 1904 lists nearly half the previous population as gone. But those who remained describe subtle changes. Clocks that lost or gained 3 minutes each day regardless of adjustment. Walls that seemed to hum faintly near dusk, and animals that refused to enter the meeting hall, even when coaxed with food. A letter written that August by a reverend traveling through the county provides the most chilling account. He records staying one night at a boarding house overlooking the river. At precisely 9:12, he wrote, the floorboards trembled as though a great weight had settled upon the roof. I thought it was thunder, yet the sky was clear. From the direction of the hall came 3 measured tones, not bells, not hammers, each separated by a pause long enough to feel the next approaching. He closed his letter with a line that the archivist underlined twice. It is not the sound that frightens me, but the way the silence seems to wait afterward. The Reverend departed the next morning. His train ticket was never redeemed. By the first frost, the hall had become a hollow thing, windows clouded from within, though the air outside stayed dry. Those who passed after dark claimed the faint reflection of lamplight shimmered across the glass despite no fire burning inside. A local child, too young to know fear, pressed her ear to the door and said she heard someone whisper, 3, 2, 1, and then nothing. In January of 1904, a traveler moving through the valley stopped at the abandoned store for shelter. His journal, later found among his belongings in a St. Louis boarding house, contains a single entry for that night. The hills hum here. When the wind stops, something else continues. I saw the bell move once, as if stirred by a breath from inside. It is at this point that the trail fractures, as all such trails do. There are rumors of federal men visiting with boxes and paper seals. There are notes in the courthouse margins mentioning containment and resonant exposure, but no official closure. Only that phrase, repeated quietly by those who remained through the winter. 3 heard, 1 withheld. The balance is maintained. And yet, history has a habit of disliking balance. The pattern would not sleep for long. By the turn of the new year, the remaining families in the valley carried on with a kind of studied normalcy. They gathered for market, cut timber, and sent their children to the neighboring township for school. But the silence never left. It changed shape and moved from sound to habit, from habit to fear. The meeting hall, once the social center, was boarded from the inside. Those planks were nailed so neatly they looked deliberate, like the work of someone protecting a secret rather than sealing a ruin. In early February, a pair of railroad surveyors arrived to chart a spur line meant to pass east of town. One of them, a young draftsman from Bowling Green, kept a meticulous field book. His entry for February 4th describes setting a tripod on the ridge above the settlement. He marked the time as 9:12 p.m., a precise observation for light refraction, he claimed, and drew a thin line tracing the horizon. But the next morning, he found the instrument turned, reoriented toward the valley floor. His partner swore he hadn't moved it. The compass still pointed north, yet the needle trembled as if responding to sound rather than a magnet. The same week, a farmhand hauling stone from the riverbed uncovered a length of cable unlike any used locally. It was copper wound, with something softer, almost pliant, the diameter of a thumb. It ran straight into the clay bank, disappearing without end. When he tugged, it held fast, humming faintly beneath the soil. The man dropped it and left it there, saying only that it seemed alive. By March, the county doctor had taken ill. His journals, later recovered by a niece who donated them to the Historical Society, show entries that disintegrate from clinical precision into something closer to confession. The vibration is in the walls now, he wrote. I tap the table, and it answers before my knuckles strike. I am no longer certain which side of the stethoscope I occupy. The last page bears a diagram of the hall, drawn from memory, with the word mirror circled 3 times, and the notation angle equals persistence. That spring, a local photographer named Emery Dent took it upon himself to document what remained. His glass negatives survive in fragments of 12 plates, each clouded at the edges. The first 6 show ordinary decay: collapsed barns, rain grooves, and the idle bell. The 7th reveals something else entirely. It depicts the interior of the hall lit by his magnesium flash. The mirror is visible, uncovered, its surface catching the burst of light. But the reflection is wrong. The benches and stove appear reversed, yet the silhouette standing before the mirror, the photographer himself, is absent. In its place stands another figure, slightly offset, facing toward him, as if the image captured both the act of looking and what was looked at. When Emery developed the plate, he collapsed from nausea. He told his assistant that the glass sang while it was fixing, a low harmonic tremor like a bow drawn over a cello string. He sealed the negative in a cedar box and refused to open it again. It was around this time that letters began arriving from out-of-state researchers, clergymen, and self-proclaimed investigators drawn by rumor. 1. A professor of natural philosophy from Lexington proposed that standing waves within the limestone could produce hallucinations. He brought instruments to test his theory: an anemometer, a galvanometer, and a handmade tuning fork carved from brass. He set up his equipment near the river one evening and began striking the fork every minute, recording its decay. Witnesses recall he stopped after the 3rd strike, stepped back, and whispered, "It's answering." The professor vanished that night. Only the fork was found, embedded upright in the river mud. For the rest of that year, the valley's pattern repeated itself with the discipline of a ritual. Storms broke in threes. Lamps sputtered 3 times before dying. The train whistle at the new spur line failed every 3rd night, then returned. The county clerk, pressed to record these anomalies, wrote one resigned line in the ledger: "Whatever this is, it counts." Then came the summer thunderstorm of July 2nd. Lightning struck the ridge above the hall, igniting a sycamore that burned without spreading. After the rain, men found the tree hollowed from within. Its heartwood crystallized into a pale mineral that rang when struck. The next evening, the bell sounded again. 3 tones, then silence so complete that the crickets stopped. That autumn, a government engineer visited under the pretext of assessing flood risk. He carried no measuring staff, only a wooden case lined with lead. He spoke with no one and stayed 2 nights in the constable's former house. On the morning of his departure, the boarded doors of the hall stood open. The mirror was gone. In its place on the desk sat the fractured brass cylinder, the needle pointed straight upward, at a hand-drawn mark on the dial. 9:12. The engineer boarded the morning train. The case he carried emitted a faint ticking heard by passengers in adjacent seats. When the snow came that winter, the valley emptied. By the census of 1905, the settlement no longer appeared by name. Its location became a blank on the county map, a space marked only withdrawn lands. The bell tower collapsed sometime during those months. No one saw it fall. In the following decade, the story calcified into folklore. Travelers spoke of an abandoned river bend, where even echoes avoided returning. Some called it the Hushed Valley. Others refused to name it at all. Yet the archives tell their own quiet truth. In 1923, a hydrologist drilling cores near the old site struck metal 70 feet down, a length of copper wound with soft alloy, identical to the farmhand's discovery 20 years earlier. The borehole emitted a steady hum until the pipe was sealed. And so, the pattern endured beneath soil and memory alike. Those who studied the records noticed an unsettling rhythm. Every 20 years, reports surfaced from that same region of muted thunder with no storm, flashes along the riverbank, and clocks faltering at the same minute. Each time, officials arrived, noted weather anomalies, and left. Each time, the paper trail thinned into silence. If history has an undertow, this was its pull. Slow, rhythmic, and patient. The story was not finished. It was simply waiting for its next breath. The story might have ended there, buried under the quiet authority of maps and new timber growth. But the earth remembers differently than people do. In 1931, long after the valley had been stricken from county records, a road crew widening the highway unearthed remnants of the old hall's foundation. They thought it was a cellar at first: flat limestone, iron hinges, and a row of nails rusted into orange teeth. But among the rubble they found a fragment of the mirror's frame, the wood blackened as if by internal fire, and embedded within it a shard of glass perfectly clear, its edges fused smooth. When the foreman lifted it, a faint tremor passed through the plank on which he stood. He described it later as the hum of a far-off telegraph pole, felt but not heard. The shard was sent to the University of Kentucky for examination. Laboratory notes, still preserved, record no impurities or heat stress that could explain the melting. But when technicians placed the glass on a wooden bench, small iron filings scattered on its surface arranged themselves into concentric rings. 3. Exactly. The assistant marking results scrawled in the margin. Acts like a compass. But toward what? Word of the finding revived local memory. A newspaper in Louisville printed a half-column titled "The Valley That Rang Thrice," embellishing freely about ghost bells and vanishing miners. It was meant as entertainment, but it brought visitors. Students, spiritualists, and skeptics are all curious, all carrying some kind of measuring device. 1. A radio hobbyist named Cray brought a crystal set and reported receiving a faint rhythmic pulse on his headset when tuned to 18 kilohertz. 3 beats, pause. 3 beats, pause. Like someone sending but forgetting the code, he told a colleague. Within the week, his equipment was confiscated by state engineers, and he was advised to relocate his experiments. He moved west, and his letter stopped in 1933. By 1934, the federal government had established a flood control project upriver. Excavation cut deep into limestone where the copper cables had once been seen. The workers complained of headaches and shivering air. Officially, blasting ceased due to budget constraints. Unofficially, one supervisor's report described auditory distortions incompatible with morale. The site was closed under the designation Geological Instability Access Restricted. That same year, a retired telegraph operator living in Tennessee wrote to a regional newspaper about a recurring transmission he'd been monitoring. Every night near 9:12, he said, the line hums low and steady, then taps 3 times. No origin station identified. No operator claims it. The story was printed once, then quietly retracted. Still, traces persisted. In 1937, a major flood swept through the region, submerging what was left of the valley beneath 30 feet of water. When it receded, a few fishermen claimed they saw light pulsing under the surface of pale rings that widened and vanished. Others swore the water itself vibrated like struck glass. Most dismissed it as silt stirred by current, but a photograph taken that day shows an odd distortion. The reflection of clouds appears doubled, as though 2 skies were folding across the same river. In the archives, there exists a single typewritten memorandum, dated April 4, 1938. Its author's name is blacked out. The subject line reads, "Containment of Resonant Field Lower River Sector." It refers to artifacts consistent with prior auditory events and instructs recipients to maintain non-metallic observation platforms. Beneath, in pencil, someone has added, "Silence is part of the mechanism." The years that followed treated the story as local superstition. Children were warned not to play near the old floodplain. Fishermen avoided setting nets there. The hum became a legend, a thing older men invoked when their clocks broke or radios faltered. But in 1949, a young surveyor with the Corps of Engineers, new to the area and ignorant of the tales, was assigned to chart subsurface anomalies for a dam expansion. His report survives in a faded folder, its tone clinical until the final paragraph. At 9:12 p.m., I recorded a pressure change equivalent to a mild seismic tremor localized within a 30-meter radius. The air tasted metallic. My wristwatch lost exactly 3 minutes and resumed of its own accord. I was alone. The Corps closed the project within the month. The dam was built farther north. No explanation given. In 1950, an elderly woman appeared at the county recorder's office, carrying a shoebox tied with string. Inside were 3 objects: a child's thimble turned upside down, a length of copper wire coiled 3 times, and a fragment of newspaper folded into a triangle. Across it, written in careful ink, were the words, "Return when the bell is quiet." She refused to give her name, left the box, and vanished into the rain. That same week, a broadcast engineer at a Lexington radio station noticed interference during the 9 p.m. hour, short bursts of static that repeated in an orderly sequence. He described it later as the sound of a signal with no sender. The next year, the U.S. Geological Survey installed new instruments along the Kentucky River Basin. Data logs show a repeating anomaly every 19.7 years, a brief, rhythmic vibration, detectable only in the limestone substrata. The pattern matches, to the minute, the events of 1903, 1923, and 1943, though no tremors were felt on the surface. By mid-century, the government stopped acknowledging the phenomenon altogether. Maps labeled the region as recreational reserve. But locals continued to note strange phenomena: lights glimpsed underwater, radios that fell silent at the same moment each night, and bells from far-off churches that seemed to echo one tone short. Then, in 1962, a construction crew dredging part of the old floodplain uncovered a sealed wooden crate lined with lead foil. Inside were dozens of wax cylinders wrapped in oilcloth. Most were degraded, but 3 still bore inscriptions. The first was labeled Test a Harmonic 3.7. The second is Teacher's Recording. The third is the Field Return Sequence. A researcher played one on a modified phonograph. The room filled with static, then a faint human voice, measured, calm, and deliberate. 3 strikes heard, 4th withheld. Observation continues. Behind the voice, a low-frequency tremor pulsed like distant thunder. When the playback ended, the machine emitted a sharp pop and died. None of the cylinders were ever played again. The crate was sent to Washington. The report classifying it cites potential cognitive interference and restricts further testing. A final annotation in red pencil reads simply, "Artifacts resonate. Do not replicate." Yet despite every closure, every file stamped complete, stories persisted like radio ghosts. Small, repeating, perfectly timed. And through them, one phrase continued to surface, scratched into walls, written on scraps, whispered by those who remembered. Count backward if you must count it all. By then, the story was no longer about a single valley. It had become an echo seeking its source, a cycle that drew nearer with every generation, patient, methodical, precise. And somewhere, under the silt and silence, the bell still waited for its answer. By 1965, the valley's name had vanished from official maps. Yet something beneath those layers of ink refused to stay buried. The Corps of Engineers charts called the area Reservoir Sector D, a sterile designation that masked its history. But hunters still spoke of the hollow that hums. They said that when fog settled across the low water, the mist would pulse faintly, expanding and contracting like a lung. No one stayed long enough to see what it exhaled. That autumn, a graduate student from the University of Louisville, researching unexplained geomagnetic patterns, spent 3 nights camping near the reservoir's edge. Her notes, recovered from her tent after she failed to return, describe precise measurements: 9:12 p.m. compass deviation, 7 degrees east. Audible low-frequency oscillation begins. Duration: 180 seconds. Source: undetermined. The final line reads, something is counting me. Her watch was found days later, waterlogged but intact, both hands frozen exactly between 9 and 10. Authorities mounted a search, but the effort was quiet and brief. Within a week, federal men arrived and declared the area off-limits due to unstable ground. Locals understood that phrase to mean something else entirely. They said the land itself was listening again. The following spring, new reports emerged from towns along the river. Residents claimed to hear faint metallic tapping carried on the current 3 tones. A pause, then 3 again. A barge captain recorded the sounds on magnetic tape. When played back at half speed, they formed a rhythm resembling human speech, with syllables stretched beyond recognition. The recording was sent to an acoustics lab in Chicago. Their analysis concluded, pattern consistent with deliberate signaling, frequency below human vocal range. The tape was lost in transit 2 weeks later. Meanwhile, a retired electrician who had worked on the 1934 flood project began building strange contraptions in his shed. His niece described them as radios without speakers, all dials and copper rings. When she asked what he hoped to hear, he answered, "It's not about hearing. It's about matching the tone." He was found dead in 1966, slumped over his workbench. The device beside him continued to hum faintly for several hours after being unplugged. By the 70s, the story had hardened into folklore again, this time in the language of late-night talk shows and gas station pamphlets. Paranormal magazines printed diagrams of supposed resonant chambers, hidden beneath Kentucky's limestone crust. Skeptics called it mass hysteria, but they never explained why the reports always aligned to the same minute, year after year, generation after generation. In 1972, a regional television crew decided to film a Halloween special at the site. The footage never aired. Station archives list the reels as damaged by magnetic interference, but a surviving transcript from the sound engineer describes something caught on the final tape. At 9:12, microphones picked up a sub-audible hum. Equipment needles froze. I shouted, "Cut!" but no one moved. The air thickened like pressure before a storm. Then came 3 tones from nowhere. Metallic, slow, deliberate. After the third, the tape tore itself from the reel. The engineer resigned the following morning and left the state. In 1978, a diver surveying the reservoir for sediment depth found a metallic object embedded in the lakebed. Cylindrical, roughly 3 feet tall, its surface inscribed with concentric circles. He managed to haul it partway to the surface before his cable snapped. The object sank, leaving a rising trail of bubbles that emitted a faint rhythmic clicking until the water went still. When questioned, the diver said something that confused the investigators. It was lighter coming up than it should have been, like it wanted to rise. He drowned 3 months later in an unrelated accident. A government memo, dated December 12, 1978, references this discovery obliquely. Prior artifact confirmed. Containment stable. No civilian disclosure permitted. Continue acoustic monitoring at standard intervals. Do not engage response frequency. The final line is underlined twice. Around this time, locals began reporting strange effects in their homes. Wall clocks stopped precisely at 9:12 p.m. and restarted minutes later, with no loss of time. Radio dials produced a low harmonic even when unplugged. Dogs howled at nothing, then cowered under furniture. No one could find a cause. Ministers called it spiritual interference. Scientists called it resonance coupling. Those who lived closest to the water stopped calling it anything. In 1983, a small museum in Frankfurt acquired a set of anonymous donations. 3 wax cylinders labeled simply H, R, and S. The curator, curious, attempted to play one on an antique phonograph. Visitors reported hearing not voices but layered frequencies, like wind blowing through hollow brass. A technician later analyzed the grooves under magnification and found them patterned with repeating geometric waves instead of normal sound engraving. Within a week, the museum closed for renovations. The cylinders disappeared from inventory. The last credible document from that decade is a research paper suppressed before publication. Its surviving abstract reads, "The Kentucky anomaly exhibits harmonic interference between 18.9 Hz and 19.2 Hz, precisely the range known to induce discomfort, disorientation, and visual hallucination in humans." However, the persistence of synchronized events suggests an external source of organization. Handwritten in the margin beside this, one reviewer scrawled, "If it organizes itself, what is it organizing for?" By 1989, the supposed centennial of the first disappearance, the air around the reservoir grew uneasy. Fishermen claimed the water sometimes rippled outward from an invisible center. At dusk, fog settled in concentric rings, faintly luminous, rotating counter to the wind. Park rangers described hearing a single chime each night as the mist lifted, even though no bell stood within miles. On October 12th of that year, the precise anniversary, a group of hikers camped near the ridge recorded an audio log that survived the event. It begins ordinarily: laughter, footsteps, and the sound of a match struck for the campfire. Then, at 9:12 p.m., the laughter stops. There's a faint vibration on the tape. Then 3 metallic tones spaced evenly apart. After the third, a whisper. "It's here." The tape continues for 6 minutes of silence, broken only by wind. The hikers were never found. Search teams recovered only their tent, undisturbed, and a brass compass lying on the ground. The needle spun continuously, tracing perfect circles even after the glass cracked. One ranger later wrote in his log, "The compass knew something we didn't." By winter, the lake froze early. Locals said the ice hummed, and when the thaw came, the sound stopped, but not completely. At the edge of hearing, beneath the wind and the water and the low drone of insects returning to life, there was still the faint pulse. 3 beats, a pause, then 3 again. The cycle, it seemed, had returned, and this time it was listening. The following spring brought officials. Quiet men with plain suits and briefcases are back to the region. They set up instruments on the ridge, with cables running down into the water. Locals assumed it was seismic work, though no one could explain why they worked exclusively at night. At 9:12 p.m. sharp, every evening for a week, their lanterns dimmed simultaneously, and the valley filled with a hum so low it rattled teeth. The sound vanished before dawn, and the men would pack away their equipment with military precision. One fisherman who rowed too close said the air near their barges shimmered, like heat without warmth. When he called out, none of the men turned. Later that year, a small-town newspaper published a 1-paragraph notice under Community Announcements. Federal Acoustic Survey completed. No hazards detected, but residents noticed the headline font was slightly smaller than usual, and the paper smelled faintly of ozone when it came off the press. Some saved their copies anyway, perhaps instinctively. The ink, after all, carried the pattern of the hum, even if the words did not. In 1991, a drifter arrived, claiming to be a former employee of the acoustic team. He took a room in a boarding house near the tracks and spent his evenings sketching geometric diagrams in the margins of hotel stationery. When asked what they represented, he replied, "Angles of reply." A local pastor found him dead 3 months later, sitting upright in bed with both hands cupped over his ears. The room's clock read 9:12. The coroner listed the cause of death as cardiac arrest induced by acute fear. If very time, the sheriff sealed the room, but the owner later admitted that for weeks afterward, the clock on the mantel would stop each night at the same minute, only to start again once the hour passed. He eventually removed it, buried it behind the barn, and heard, he swore, the faint ticking continue beneath the soil. 2 years later, an archivist in Frankfurt sorting state geological documents came across a misfiled roll of magnetic tape. Its label read, Sector D Resonance Tests 1961. Expecting old environmental data, she played it through a reel-to-reel deck. The tape opened with ambient static, then a low oscillation that gradually aligned into a rhythm. 3 pulses, a pause, and 3 more. A man's voice followed, weary but calm. Sequence continues. Human presence recorded, adjusting amplitude. The archivist stopped the playback immediately. She returned the reel to its box and placed it in a separate file marked miscellaneous. The next morning, the tape was gone. Her supervisor dismissed her account as misplacement, but she resigned within the month, telling colleagues she'd begun to dream in patterns of 3. In 1995, a television documentary crew revisited the site, hoping to capitalize on the growing wave of interest in unexplained phenomena. They brought drones, underwater cameras, and electromagnetic sensors. Footage recovered from their last night shows the crew joking by the campfire as mist drifts from the water. One of them remarks, "It's quieter than it should be." Another laughs, "Even the frogs clock out early here." Then the camera shakes just slightly, as if the ground itself has exhaled. The sound comes unmistakable, metallic, and patient. 3 distinct tones, a pause, then 3 again. The camera tilts toward the water, catching only the reflection of the moon, and beneath it, a faint circle of light expanding outward, as if from a submerged bell. The footage ends abruptly. Their van was found the next morning on the access road. Engine cold, keys still in the ignition, no one inside. By this point, patterns of loss had become their own grim arithmetic. 1 investigator per decade, 1 artifact per generation, 1 sound repeating across a century. It was less an event now than a language, a vocabulary of absence, of people called by something older than the soil itself. In 2001, construction of a new hydroelectric plant threatened to flood the entire basin. The project stalled when engineers reported equipment interference and unexplained resonant feedback. A memorandum classified the frequency as potentially hazardous to human perception, citing disorientation and fainting among workers exposed to prolonged vibrations. Work was suspended indefinitely. Official reason: budgetary reassessment. Unofficial: psychological risk. The years after saw sporadic but consistent reports from hikers and maintenance staff of lights beneath the water, static on radios that formed the faint cadence of speech, and dreams of standing in an old hall before a mirror that showed nothing but an endless corridor of reflections. One maintenance worker claimed the hum seemed to follow him home, threading itself through the hum of his refrigerator, the buzz of his television, and the pulse in his own ears. "It's counting," he told his supervisor, "and when it reaches 3, it listens back." He quit the next day and left the state. In 2009, during an unusually dry winter, water levels dropped enough to expose part of the original valley floor. Urban explorers descended into the cracked clay, photographing the remnants of foundations and rusted fences. Among the images posted online was one that defied easy explanation. It showed the faint outline of a bell, not made of metal, but of mineral, an impression fused into the rock, perfectly circular and marked by concentric ridges. Geological analysis suggested the pattern was formed by extreme vibration, as if the stone itself had been played like an instrument. That same month, residents in towns miles away reported an audible phenomenon during an otherwise clear night. Seismographs recorded nothing, but multiple witnesses described feeling pressure in their chests, like the moment before thunder. It lasted exactly 60 seconds, ending at 9:12 p.m. A few reported hearing a woman's voice just beneath the hum, repeating a single word that none could agree on. Some thought it was return. Others heard remember. A linguist analyzing the recordings noted that the waveform matched the shape of a human sigh stretched across time. The federal response came swiftly: temporary restrictions, survey drones, and a polite public statement attributing the event to electrical interference during atmospheric inversion. But satellite data later revealed a faint concentric disturbance pattern on the reservoir's surface, lasting several minutes. After the alleged inversion, the circles expanded outward evenly, dissipating only when they reached the ridge. The following year, a fisherman retrieved something tangled in his net, a pocket watch, corroded and water-stained, yet still ticking. The glass was cracked, the hands frozen between 9 and 10. Etched inside the case were 3 small parallel lines. He sold it at a pawn shop in Lexington. The shop burned to the ground that night, leaving no trace of the watch. And so the century turned again. The patterns aligned, the hum persisted, and the old valley, whatever it had once been, remained patient beneath its blanket of water and time. Those who studied it knew the intervals. Every few decades, the sound returned stronger, clearer, and more insistent. It wasn't just an echo anymore. It was a conversation, waiting for a response. What none of them yet understood was that the next alignment would not be confined to the valley. It would spread through power lines, airwaves, and the quiet circuitry of modern life, carrying the old rhythm into new machinery. 3 tones, a pause. 3 tones, a pause. The past, speaking fluently in the language of the present. And if the pattern continued, as all evidence suggested it would, then the next call was already on its way, rising through the water, finding the frequencies we built to listen, ready for someone, somewhere, to answer. The first to notice were the technicians at a local broadcast tower outside Lexington. In March of 2011, their frequency monitors began registering a persistent, low-bandwidth pulse around 18.9 hertz, inaudible to the human ear, but visible on their screens as a thin, rhythmic tremor. They logged it as interference and filed a maintenance ticket. Within days, neighboring towers reported the same anomaly, synchronized to the minute. None of their equipment shared a power grid, and yet the pattern aligned perfectly. 3 pulses, pause, 3 more, every 24 hours at precisely 9:12 p.m. The technicians joked about ghosts in the spectrum until one of them played the signal through a subwoofer. The room filled with a faint vibration that made the fluorescent lights flicker. Then came a second tone, softer, higher, almost like breathing through glass. That week, digital clocks in a 30-mile radius lost exactly 3 seconds before correcting themselves. Power companies blamed voltage fluctuations, but data logs showed the drop had no identifiable cause. Cell towers flickered offline momentarily, their indicator lights blinking 3 times before stabilizing. News outlets never mentioned it, but police dispatch records from that night show a flurry of calls reporting unidentified humming and mirrors vibrating on the wall. Most callers hung up mid-sentence. A team from the University of Kentucky's physics department requested permission to study the anomaly. They brought portable seismographs and magnetometers to the reservoir and recorded continuous data over 3 nights. Their report, partially declassified years later, described a pattern consistent with a self-correcting waveform, an oscillation that actively compensated for environmental interference. In simpler terms, it was listening back. On the second night, all 5 researchers noted auditory aftereffects long after leaving the site, a persistent pulse behind the ears, like the memory of a heartbeat that wasn't theirs. 2 withdrew from the project, citing migraines and insomnia. The lead researcher filed a final note before abandoning the study entirely. It's not from below, it's between. By summer, the phenomenon had expanded beyond the valley. Amateur radio operators across Kentucky began receiving irregular bursts of static, followed by structured silence intervals measured at 3.7 seconds, a duration identical to the pause between tones in the earliest recordings from decades prior. The FCC issued a brief statement advising broadcasters to ignore the low-frequency intrusion, describing it as environmental resonance triggered by natural formations. But in the weeks following, several operators reported something new embedded within the hum: faint modulations that, when amplified and slowed, resembled fragments of human speech. The phrases were incomplete syllables stretched until meaning dissolved, yet certain words emerged repeatedly. Among them, wait, open, and mirror. Meanwhile, incidents multiplied. Hospital monitors flickered at the same minute each night. Elevator alarms tripped spontaneously in downtown Lexington, their bells ringing 3 times without cause. Home security systems triggered motion alerts, recording only empty hallways bathed in static. A pattern emerged among witnesses. Those closest to metal structures described feeling a soft pressure against their eardrums, as if the sound were emanating through the architecture itself. In late August, a commuter train halted unexpectedly near the old floodplain. The conductor reported that the tracks ahead shimmered, like heat above asphalt. Every onboard clock displayed 9:12. When inspectors arrived hours later, they found the rails cool to the touch, but faintly magnetized, as if exposed to a passing current. A technician, attempting to measure the anomaly, suffered vertigo and described hearing a bell underwater. His instruments recorded nothing. Publicly, the events were dismissed as technical coincidences. Privately, agencies revisited old archives. The sealed boxes, the confiscated tapes, and the wax cylinders marked H and S. Within those forgotten artifacts, the rhythm matched perfectly. One internal memo, dated 2012, contained a single handwritten note at the bottom margin. Cycle consistent. Source adapting. Do not initiate contact. But contact, it seemed, was no longer a choice. That autumn, digital spectrographs began registering harmonic overtones, faint ripples of frequency expanding outward from the 18.9 Hz base. Audio engineers noticed that recordings of rainfall, wind, and even human voices showed faint traces of the same structure embedded in their waveform. It was as if the pattern had nested inside ordinary sound, teaching it to resonate. By October, listeners on shortwave bands began reporting spontaneous synchronization, their radios locking into the pulse without tuning, as if compelled. One night, a station in Bowling Green broadcast its evening weather report. In the middle of the segment, the anchor's voice slowed, distorted, and then merged seamlessly into the hum. The transmission continued for 1 minute, then returned to normal. The audio log later revealed that during the distortion, a voice, softer, overlapping the anchors, whispered something indecipherable beneath the tone. Sound analysts who studied the recording claimed that it wasn't an echo. It was an entirely separate signal, modulating through her voice like a second speaker trying to be heard through the same mouth. The event was never aired again, but those who worked that night swore the station's mirrors mounted behind the cameras began to vibrate. Their surfaces fogged briefly from within, like exhalation against glass. 2 months later, on December 3rd, the phenomenon reached its first recorded peak. Every audio monitoring system in the state, public, private, and military, registered a synchronized surge at 9:12 p.m. The pulse carried across soil, air, and water, reverberating through bridges and subways and the fine steel of electrical towers. Then came silence so deep that even insects stopped. When sound returned, it arrived layered. 3 tones, a pause, and 3 more. But this time, a 4th tone followed a faint, descending chime that trembled and dissolved like a breath. The following day, an atmospheric researcher in Frankfurt submitted a report titled Harmonic Reversal Observed. The file included a spectrogram annotated with a simple, chilling remark. The signal acknowledged receipt. There lettered still. 2 days later, she resigned from her post. When colleagues came to collect her research, they found her office dark, papers neatly arranged, and her computer displaying a blank document with 3 parallel lines drawn across the screen. No one saw her again. By then, those paying attention understood the implication. For over a century, something beneath Kentucky's limestone had been counting, adjusting, and waiting for the medium to evolve enough to answer. And now, through wires and signals and the soft, obedient circuitry of a connected world, it had found its reply. But the hum did not grow louder. It grew quieter and more precise. As if having reached its listener, it no longer needed to shout. The line, once a murmur in the hills, had finally gone two-way. The only question left was what conversation had begun. In early 2012, the hum no longer came from the valley. It came through everything that could listen. Air conditioners throbbed in unison. Street lamps flickered once, twice, and 3 times before stabilizing. Phone calls carried a faint undertone, like a heartbeat, just below audibility. When lines went silent, the silence itself seemed sculpted, deliberate, as though someone on the other end was waiting for a reply. Engineers called it a cascading harmonic event. Pastors called it judgment in frequency. Those who had lived near the old reservoir simply said, "It's awake again." On March 9th, residents across central Kentucky reported what meteorologists later termed a temperature inversion. The sky glowed faintly blue-white for less than a minute. Dogs howled, clocks stuttered, and at 9:12 p.m., the hum returned steady, precise, and impossibly even. Amateur radio enthusiasts who recorded it captured something extraordinary. The sound no longer emanated outward. It folded inward. The waveform, when plotted, inverted itself as a mirror image of previous pulses, as if the transmission had begun playing in reverse. Around this time, emails circulated among a closed network of physicists, once associated with government acoustic programs. They referenced an experiment underway near the reservoir using underwater microphones, or hydrophones, designed to record ambient geological noise. What they captured instead was a faint human voice, layered within the frequency range of the hum. A single word repeated again and again, distorted but unmistakable. Below, the file was marked as corrupted and quarantined from all systems within hours. But copies resurfaced online, stripped of metadata, leaking through forums before vanishing again. Those who downloaded it claimed their computers began freezing nightly at 9:12. Then came the first of what authorities would later classify as collective auditory episodes. In May, during a crowded spring fair in Somerset, hundreds of attendees fell silent simultaneously. Witnesses described the same sensation, a pressure in the chest, followed by a soft tone that seemed to originate from inside the skull rather than outside it. Many dropped to their knees, covering their ears, though no one else could hear. The episode lasted 60 seconds. When it ended, clocks across the fairground all read 9:12 exactly. Local hospitals documented no physical injury, but noted a striking detail. Every victim's heartbeat had synchronized to an identical rhythm during the event. 3 beats, pause. 3 beats, pause. Within days, news outlets speculated about environmental toxins, undetected tremors, or mass hysteria. Federal agents dismissed all theories publicly, but satellite imaging of the reservoir area from that same night revealed concentric ripples expanding outward for several miles, visible only in infrared. As summer came, researchers working independently began to notice connections. Seismographs from Tennessee, Ohio, and West Virginia all recorded minute fluctuations at the same nightly interval. Oceanic buoys off the Atlantic coast began pinging error codes as though detecting tremors. One private observatory in Arizona recorded atmospheric vibrations corresponding to the same frequency. The implication was staggering. The resonance that had begun in a single valley was now global. When asked how that could be possible, one retired scientist, formerly of the 60s Containment Project, replied in an interview that was quickly pulled offline. "You think it's sound moving through air. It's not. It's instruction moving through matter." By August, domestic incidents grew stranger. People reported mirrors vibrating softly, their surfaces rippling like water under pressure. Audio engineers noticed short-wave signals, aligning perfectly with reflections recorded on cameras, light itself bending fractionally at the pulse's arrival. Surveillance systems malfunctioned, their infrared sensors overwhelmed by sudden bursts of luminescence that traced perfect circles before fading. Across homes, workplaces, and quiet rooms, objects began reacting to unseen rhythms, keys rattling on tables, picture frames shifting minutely, and always the same number of movements. 3. In September, a retired librarian named Eileen Mott sent a letter to the Lexington Courier, claiming to have deciphered the pattern. She'd spent months cataloging the intervals, the pauses, and the timing. According to her, it wasn't a warning, it was a countdown. Each cycle, she wrote, shortened by fractions of a second, converging on an exact date and hour, April 3, 2013. The paper never published her letter, but it survives in the archives, annotated in red pen by an editor who scrawled, "Possible crank. Verify math." When April arrived, the countdown held true. On the evening of the 3rd, satellite weather images showed a dense fog bank forming spontaneously over central Kentucky. It stretched for miles, circular, revolving counterclockwise. At 9:12 p.m., every seismograph in the state registered a spike, not violent, but impossibly precise. Eyewitnesses described the air turning thick, luminous, like glass breathing. Then came the sound. Not loud, not even fully audible, just pressure, the presence of the tone itself, vibrating through bone. Those near the old reservoir swore they saw the water rise an inch without spilling. Others claimed they heard voices layered within the hum, speaking not in unison but in sequence, as if conversing across time. Emergency dispatches flooded with reports of lights moving through fog, too geometric to be natural, rotating triangles of cold blue radiance, flickering like a code. Cell service failed statewide for 70 seconds. When it returned, several towers transmitted short bursts of garbled audio. Analysts later reconstructed fragments. Threshold complete. Observation accepted. And one phrase repeated in rising pitch: "The mirror opens." The following morning, air traffic controllers in 3 states reported radar reflections consistent with massive vertical columns over the region, visible for only 9 seconds before fading entirely. No aircraft was detected. Power substations within a 40-mile radius tripped simultaneously, causing rolling blackouts that lasted through the night. The event was never acknowledged in official reports, but among the classified memoranda circulated afterward, one bears a single handwritten annotation beside the timestamp 9:12. Contact achieved. In the weeks that followed, nothing more happened. No lights, no sounds, no missing people. But across Kentucky, strange, subtle changes persisted. Radios left unplugged, hummed faintly. Watch hands drifted, losing alignment by seconds each day. Mirrors, long since still, developed hairline fractures shaped like concentric rings. And those who had heard the hum before, who'd lived near the reservoir or its buried twin beneath the soil, found themselves dreaming of rooms filled with dust and glass, of reflections that breathed when they did not. The government released no statements. The scientific community fell silent. But an unmarked file appeared in a private digital archive months later, tagged only with a date and 3 dashes. Its contents were a single line of text: "The valley answered, awaiting next transmission." The hum, once thought to be a relic of forgotten machinery or natural resonance, had evolved. It had become communication between what and whom no one dared to name. And though surface calm returned, instruments across the world continued to pick up faint signatures buried in static, all synchronized to a single minute that refused to pass: 9:12 p.m. In the quiet that followed the 2013 event, Kentucky seemed to exhale. The fog lifted, the power grid stabilized, radios returned to static and song. But beneath that surface calm, the rhythm persisted, softer now, folded deeper into the fabric of things. Those who had monitored the hum for decades said it was no longer trying to be heard. It was listening again, as it always had after each alignment. Only this time, the interval between cycles was shrinking. The first clue came from astronomers at a small observatory near Owensboro. In late 2014, their instruments began detecting a faint oscillation in the optical data from certain stars. Tiny, periodic fluctuations that followed the same triplet rhythm documented in the Kentucky files. At first, they assumed faulty calibration, but the pattern appeared across multiple telescopes in different states. One researcher, cross-referencing timestamps, discovered that each optical pulse coincided precisely with 9:12 p.m. Eastern Time. It's synchronized, she wrote in her log. The signal isn't just under the ground anymore. It's reflecting. Around the same time, geologists studying river sediment noticed a peculiar magnetic layering. The strata carried alternating bands of mineral alignment, north, and south, in evenly spaced intervals, corresponding to roughly 100 years. As if, they mused, the Earth itself had been recording cycles of resonance long before humans arrived to measure them. By 2015, patterns of small disappearances began anew. Fishermen leaving empty boats adrift. Hikers whose compasses spun until batteries drained. Electrical engineers found asleep at their desks, beside computers displaying nothing but 3 parallel white lines on a black background. Police reports described these cases as unconnected, but every incident occurred within 60 seconds of the same minute. Witnesses said they felt a sound without hearing it, just before each person vanished. A pressure that seemed to pull their own reflections forward a fraction of a second before their bodies followed. In June, a research vessel on the Ohio River detected a sonar echo emanating upward from beneath the old reservoir's coordinates. The depth reading was impossible. There was nothing but bedrock for hundreds of feet below. Yet the echo persisted, repeating every 3 seconds. When the captain adjusted the frequency to 18.9 hertz, the signal returned stronger, forming what the sonar's onboard display interpreted as a shape, a vertical column tapering to a point, like the spire of a bell frozen mid-swing. The crew recorded 20 minutes of data before the machine overheated. The recovered image, printed and stored in a sealed envelope, bore one handwritten note along the bottom: not reflection, projection. That autumn, unconfirmed reports surfaced of private contractors working under government oversight, conducting stability studies in the region. Locals described seeing cranes and unmarked trucks arriving by night, hauling lead-lined containers and heavy cables. No one ever heard engines start or stop. The equipment simply appeared, then disappeared days later. The only trace left behind was a series of shallow pits in the soil, each ringed by blackened grass that refused to regrow. Meanwhile, people who had lived through the earlier cycles began to experience identical dreams. They described standing in a vast underground chamber made of smooth limestone, the walls carved with concentric circles that pulsed with dim blue light. At the center hung something vast and suspended, like an enormous pendulum made of stone. Each time it moved, the ground itself seemed to breathe. And within that breath came the voice, not loud, but intimate, almost tender, saying, "The door is not a place, it's a moment." Psychologists dismiss these accounts as mass suggestion, but neurophysiologists examining the dreamer's EEG patterns discovered something stranger. Their brain waves aligned precisely during the minutes surrounding 9:12 p.m., regardless of time zone. When mapped globally, the readings formed a single continuous waveform, a kind of planetary hum echoing through the human nervous system. In 2016, a graduate student compiling oral histories from the surviving families of the valley uncovered a recording mislabeled in the state archive. It was an interview conducted in 1951 with a man who had been a child during the earliest days of the phenomenon. His voice trembled with age but carried an odd serenity. "It's not trying to scare us," he said. "It's trying to remember itself." Every 100 years, it asks who's listening. Every time we build something that can answer, it gets closer. The interviewer asked what would happen when it finally remembered. The old man paused for a long moment before saying, "Then it won't need a valley anymore." That prophecy felt abstract until 2017, when strange electromagnetic readings began appearing as far away as Maine, Oregon, and the British Isles. Each matched the Kentucky frequency, as though the hum had propagated through the planet's crust. Satellite magnetometers registered faint auroral flickers above regions with no corresponding solar activity. The light came in triplets, 3 pulses, a pause, then 3 again. Some nights, it lingered over the ocean, casting ghostly rings of phosphorescence across the waves. Governments convened panels quietly. Linguists were brought in beside physicists. The conclusion reached in classified minutes was unnerving. The frequency was encoding data in an expanding lattice of mathematical ratios that, when visualized, resembled not random noise but structure. The more complete the recordings became, the more they mirrored the architecture of organic tissue, as though the hum was constructing something not out of matter, but out of pattern itself. By 2018, laboratories across continents detected minute shifts in resonance thresholds of metals and crystals. Certain alloys began vibrating faintly when exposed to ordinary environmental sounds, forming harmonics that matched the Kentucky signature. Computer drives corrupted spontaneously at 9:12 p.m., overwriting random sections of code with repeating sequences of numbers 3, 7, 12, 3, 7, 12. In binary, it translated to nonsense. But in frequency, it formed a tone that resonated exactly with the limestone of the old valley. That winter, the first global incident occurred. All GPS satellites briefly lost synchronization for 60 seconds at 9:12 Universal Time. During that minute, radio astronomers monitoring deep space signals recorded a new anomaly, a burst from within our solar system. Its spectral fingerprint identical to the hum, but amplified beyond comprehension. The transmission lasted precisely 3 minutes. Then, nothing. The next day, an internal memo from a major observatory contained a single question scrawled in the margin. Did we just hear it from both sides? For those who remembered Hollow Creek and the valley that rang thrice, the answer no longer mattered. The hum was no longer a local haunting. It had become a condition of the world. It no longer needed caves or copper wire or flooded halls. Every phone, every circuit, every reflective surface was now a vessel. And yet, through all the noise, the pattern stayed patient, unchanging, faithful to its rhythm. 3 beats, pause. 3 beats, pause. Waiting, perhaps, not for discovery, but for recognition. Because the closer it drew, the clearer its message became. It wasn't calling from the deep. It was calling through us. By 2020, the hum had become background, like weather, like static. Scientists still published cautious papers about geomagnetic oscillations and low-frequency atmospheric coupling, but even they had begun to phrase their conclusions in the passive voice, as though afraid to assign agency. The truth was simpler and stranger. The world was now tuned. The frequency no longer came from one place. It threaded through everything that could hold a charge, everything capable of reflecting or remembering. The old valley was only where it had first been heard clearly, before our machines learned to echo it. When the pandemic silenced highways and skies, seismographs around the planet registered a drop in human-made vibration. For the first time in a century, the Earth itself grew quiet. That was when the hum grew loudest. Amateur recordists trapped in their apartments uploaded hundreds of files to online forums. Identical pulses, hidden beneath refrigerator buzzes, air vents, and even in the hiss of phone microphones. Some heard it as music, others as pressure behind the eyes. A few swore that if they stayed perfectly still, they could hear words forming inside the intervals, 3 syllables repeating, "We were here." In 2022, an atmospheric monitoring satellite captured a reflection it couldn't explain, an arc of pale light stretching from the Gulf to the Great Lakes, visible only at 9:12 p.m. For precisely 1 minute. Analysis showed the curve wasn't random. It traced the same pattern as the original Kentucky ridgeline before the flood projects. The image, leaked by a technician months later, bore an attached note: "The map is learning its shape again." In Resigned the Great Level Like Incretion Surf. That winter, a linguistics lab at MIT published a paper on infrasound communication across natural mediums. Buried deep in the appendices was a dataset of 9,000 entries of human-generated low-frequency recordings. When plotted together, they formed an interference pattern matching the structure of a human cochlea, scaled up to the size of a continent. In other words, the noise wasn't random at all. It was an ear. Something was listening through us. On the anniversary of the first disappearance on April 3, 2023, electrical grids worldwide flickered for a single minute. No outages, no surges, just an invisible pause. Surveillance cameras caught strange synchronized movements, curtains swaying in closed rooms, door handles turning slightly, and reflective surfaces misting from within. Every digital timestamp adjusted itself 3 seconds backward, then resumed as if nothing had happened. The effect was universal, global, and wordless. The hum, now woven into everything, had achieved perfect phase alignment. For that 1 minute, all sound, cars, wind, speech, and even thought, some said, resonated in harmonic unison. Afterward, there was no official statement. Communications returned, satellites continued, and factories hummed. But instruments built to measure atmospheric pressure began logging a new constant, a barely measurable offset, pulsing faintly, like a second heartbeat beneath the planet's own. The world's clocks did not agree anymore. Time itself had developed an echo. By 2025, the pattern no longer appeared as sound. It manifested visually in screens that flickered when no signal was transmitted, in photographs developing faint concentric rings, and in digital errors forming 3 pale lines across corrupted files. People stopped talking about it. They'd accepted it like a low wind or background radiation, proof of something immense and ongoing. But for those who had been watching since the beginning, the silence that followed was not peace. It was listening. The last recorded testimony came from an independent researcher in Lexington, a woman who'd spent decades tracing the hum's progression. She left a single voicemail before vanishing. It's not outside us anymore. It's become the carrier wave for thought. When we dream, it dreams back. Her apartment was found undisturbed, save for a mirror on the desk cracked into 3 perfect arcs and a digital recorder still running. The waveform it captured shows 3 tones: a pause, 3 more, and then a final, lower resonance, one that fades into the threshold of human hearing and never returns. Across the years, from the first bell in the valley to the last global pulse, the pattern has remained exact. It does not ask for belief. It asks only for attention. Every few decades, it reminds us, through copper and stone, through signal and silence, that the boundary between listener and echo was always porous. And if, tonight, somewhere in the quiet between machines, you feel the air vibrate just once, 3 small tremors in the dark, do not speak. Do not listen too closely. Because whatever was once contained beneath the Kentucky limestone has found the perfect amplifier, us. And it is still counting. 3, pause, 3, pause, then something new begins. If stories like this hold your attention, if you believe that buried records, forgotten echoes, and unanswered transmissions deserve to be heard, then stay with us, subscribe, and keep listening. Because the archive isn't finished, and neither, it seems, is the hum.